Welcome. This is Sansad TV. My name is Vikram Chandra, and I'm here for a series of special interviews at the time of the budget. And who better to talk to understand not just the budget, but also the state of the Indian economy right now, what's been happening for the last 10 years, what the roadmap is in the years ahead. Then the Finance Secretary, Mr. G. Somanathan. Sir, thank you so much. It's a privilege having you, to getting a chance to talk to you. This budget seems to be a bit more of a report card on what's been happening, and we've been promised a full roadmap in the month of July. But before I ask you about the interim budget itself, what is your sense of how the economy is placed?
I think the economy is doing well. I think that's a very short summary. I think both in terms of where we were a few years ago and in terms of other countries. I think India is growing faster than most other countries, in fact, almost all other major economies. And in terms of our performance post the pandemic, we have picked up faster than others. And I think the calibrated response that the government of India gave in 2020-21, the kind of prudent fiscal stimulus rather than a very massive one, has paid dividends, as a result of which growth has actually picked up faster in India than in many other economies after the pandemic.
And also, so that stimulus came not so much in just demand side measures, but supply side measures which have created
credit measures in particular. We were able to be frugal with the use of fiscal resources because we had this very successful credit guarantee scheme, the emergency credit line guarantee scheme, which meant that a large number of businesses were able to continue to borrow during the pandemic, even though their businesses had basically were seeing no revenue, and the borrowings were guaranteed by the government of India, and we continue to pay out monies against those guarantees. But this meant that about 350,000 crores, 350,000 crores of funds could flow to private enterprise without necessarily imposing that amount of fiscal burden. And the fiscal burden is far smaller than that because we end up paying only for the defaults. And most of these enterprises after the pandemic have come back to life. And so the defaults are far smaller than the amount of credit given. If we had tried to keep them alive through fiscal stimuli at that time, then the outgoes would have been much larger. So the approach that we took at that time has now, with hindsight, I can say has proved to be a success.
When you're saying that India is a bright spot, this is one of those moments where the rest of the world also seems to be acknowledging it, that this is a good spot for the Indian economy, and potentially we're in a phase that could continue for a while. It is not being propped up by profligate spending or other things. The quality of the finances are good. The fiscal deficit is coming down. A lot of the government spending is in productive assets like infrastructure. So therefore, the stage is set for a fairly decent run for the Indian economy for a while. Would you agree with that?
I would agree with that. I think if we continue to follow prudent policies, both fiscally and in terms of structural reforms, and continue to do well the things that we have been doing well, I think we are in a good place. And I think the government's objective of making India a developed country by 2047 is not a pipe dream. I think it is within the realm of achievability. And I think the steps that we've taken in this budget, which is of course an interim budget, and the steps that will be taken by governments in the future, I think are such. I think the prospects of achieving that goal are bright.
When I come back to that question which you said about prudence, you've repeatedly used the words prudence, fiscal consolidation, and we've got a fairly ambitious roadmap that even the finance minister has just laid out, saying 5.8 will come down to 5.1, going to 4.5. And this is happening without a clear indication that we're going to tighten our belts on things like welfare measures or on spending. And there's no clear indication, at least so far, that taxes are going to be are going to be hiked dramatically. How then is the magic happening?
So it's happening because growth is good. The economy is growing at a nominal. We expect the economy to grow at a nominal rate of 10.5% next year. We expect taxes to grow slightly faster than that at about 11.5%. But what we are doing is to constrain expenditure growth below 10.5%. So in a sense, it is a simple strategy where revenue grows faster than GDP and expenditure grows slower than GDP, but grows. So it's not that we are shutting down expenditure or cutting expenditure. Expenditure continues to grow, and in some cases like capital expenditure, it continues to grow even faster than GDP growth at 11.1% against a 10.5% GDP growth. But revenue expenditure is being controlled tightly to grow at a pace lower than GDP growth. And this is primarily coming from a tight control over avoidable revenue expenditure, not necessarily on schematic expenditure or on items of particular importance to the poor or to the vulnerable or to the rural population. We are also benefited in this from the fact that some of the subsidies are looking like being less costly next year because of external circumstances. So for instance, the last 2 years have witnessed very high fertilizer subsidies because of a very large spike in commodity prices. That is abating. Now that reduction in global prices, we keep our prices fixed for the farmers largely, especially for urea, as a result of which any reduction in global prices translates into a reduction in subsidy. So we can very realistically expect a reduction in fertilizer subsidies in the coming year. On other programs, we've actually provided what the departments need in terms of welfare and centrally sponsored schemes. We've not consciously sought to cut them. So I think this combination of tight control on things like salaries, office expenses, whatever is avoidable, we control very tightly. Schematic expenditure we provide as necessary, and some subsidies we've been able to manage, partly because of external circumstances like commodity prices, but also because we have better management of subsidies now through DBT, and the waste is going down. We've been able to eliminate a lot of bogus beneficiaries in various government schemes, as a result of which without any spectacular growth in the expenditure, we're actually meeting the requirements of the target population.
I'm going to keep on talking to you a little bit about expenditure, because you're of course also expenditure secretary. When you're talking, so subsidies is one aspect of it, but as India pledges itself to spend more on health, for example, Ayushman Bharat, that's being rolled forward even further, maybe a lot of expenditure that we want to do on education. There are multiple other schemes which are having a major impact, whether it's water, whether it is the food program which is being done. So the government is committed to continuing those welfare measures, and do you think it's going to start requiring more and more money? If as healthcare gets to everybody, maybe more money will be required?
The fact is that outlays on health, education, water are actually increasing in the coming budget. So they're not declining. Every one of them is increasing. Now, should we spend even more? Ideally, yes, but I would point to 2 points. One, in areas like, particularly in education, the most important issue confronting us in education, both at the primary and secondary level and at the higher education level, is not quantity or money, it is quality. It is not that we don't have enough teachers or enough school rooms or enough blackboards or enough electronic blackboards or enough equipment for children to use. It is the quality of teaching. That is not a parameter which can directly be influenced by money. It's a matter of managerial improvements, administrative improvements, making people attend, making them show up, getting them trained better. So the challenge in many parts for us is not financial. We have serious non-financial issues, especially at state level, to confront. So they are not necessarily sectors where this conventional approach of, the solution is to go from X to Y% of GDP may be necessary, but only after you fix the way it works. Otherwise, you can just throw more money after it and not have an outcome. On both of these, there is also a sharing of responsibility with the states, where primary responsibility both for education, particularly primary and secondary education, and for health is with the states. So we have to, yes, we will have to increase action. The second point on the same issue is that when we look at percentages of GDP spent on sectors like health and education, aspirationally, it's good to look at international comparators. But when you look at international comparators, you also have to look at their tax to GDP ratios, because money has to come from somewhere. Now, if you have a particular level of taxation, then you can only afford a certain amount of expenditure. So any long-term increase will have to be accompanied by revenue increases, which is where the whole effort to improve our tax collection, tax efficiency becomes critical.
And I'll come to that in just a couple of minutes where the money is coming in from. But turning again, staying with expenditure, you're right in saying that there seems to be a bet on growth, and bets on growth can pay off and can become a very positive, virtuous cycle, so long as a lot of the expenditure is also going into building productive assets, building capacity for further growth. And that, I think, is the reason why so many people welcome the expenditure on capex, in particular in infrastructure. There's been this major infrastructure spend. How much more do you think still needs to be built? And at some point, I'm sure you're going to rely on the private sector to also come in and start investing.
So I think the levels of capital expenditure as a proportion of gross domestic product that we have currently are approximately the levels that we need to be at and which we can sustain. So I think we are approximately, that doesn't mean that this is where we will stop. As the GDP grows, the absolute amounts will keep rising. But I don't see much, I see neither the scope nor the necessity for it to keep increasing as a proportion of GDP beyond where we are now in terms of public expenditure on infrastructure.
So as a percentage of GDP, this would be the sort of a limit, and then of course as GDP
I'm not
grows.
saying this is not a holy number or anything, but approximately this order of magnitude is where we should be and where we can afford to be.
In a troubled world, defense spending, that might be something where certainly you have to spend a lot of money given what's happening around
It's
the
already
world.
having an impact. We are already at fairly elevated levels of revenue expenditure on defense because of the situation on our borders and so on. So yes, that is a risk which will come into play, but I think the government's efforts to indigenize procurement of defense equipment are beginning to show results, and a lot of this equipment is being developed by the private sector, not by the old Indian ordnance factories, but by the private sector, and both in quality and price terms they are very competitive with international supplies. So this in the long run will help us get more out of our defense spend without necessarily increasing it in the proportion that it would appear to be necessary if we were merely buying from abroad. So we are getting better value for money on our defense spend.
Turning to the tax side and the revenue side, there seems to have been a strategy out there also, technology, third-party data coming in to help you figure out who's actually not paying their taxes. But at the same time, Laffer saying that, let's get the rates down, people will pay more. And ease of compliance, there seems to be an effort to try and trust the taxpayer, nudge instead of have a danda, say that, you can send you reminders and we can allow you to change your that seems to have had a certain amount of impact in the buoyancy that we are
I think
seeing.
that is one of the major reasons for the buoyancy there is, particularly this system of reporting to you the information the tax department has about you has proved very effective, both as a reminder for things that may fall away from one's cognizance at the time of filing a return. It reminds you that, look, you did all of these things and this is what we have, we know you did this, we know you did that. That has helped a lot of voluntary improvement in tax declarations. It's not that people were not filing returns earlier, but they were omitting certain things, some of them unconsciously, some of them perhaps consciously, but now you get this information when you file your return, and it's promoting a more accurate declaration of incomes by a lot of people. And that's one of the reasons for this pickup in earlier, particularly for the non-salaried class, it was not so apparent as to how much they ought to pay. Now there are some clear markers about their transactions in terms of high value purchases, their expenditure on expensive cars or jewelry or deposits and investments, and all of this is not merely with the tax man and with someone saying after you filed your return, coming after you and saying, oh, you know what, you didn't do this. Now you are told before you file your return, look, this is the form 26 AS, look at it, this is what we think you've done, and now please file your return. And that's producing very good results.
And also being linked increasingly with GST and other data.
That's right. That's it. Data sharing between direct and indirect taxes is another very major improvement, which means that the correlation between the returns that a business declares for indirect taxes and the income it ought to have earned on that turnover for direct taxes can now be compared.
The very interesting aspect of this budget was the fact that you actually had some sort of an amnesty for old cases, the desire that
it's not an amnesty at all. I need to correct that. It's not an amnesty at all. These are amounts that we are not even sure due to be paid. Right. These are amounts where typically, in fact, if you see the wording in the budget speech, We have something saying you owe us some money. You, in most cases, say, I've already paid it and I have a challan, but I don't have a copy of your challan because these were old manual records in different assessment offices, which got consolidated into a computer. Earlier, when they were not consolidated, we wouldn't even hold back this year's refund against that old balance which was on a different file. Now that everything's consolidated, you have somebody telling you, oh, you know what, you have a refund for 22, 23, but there is this 1967 100 rupees and until you pay that, I can't give you this refund. And then you say, what, I mean, I don't have, I mean, 67 is an exaggeration, but we do have cases. We have cases right from 1961. So what is happening here is the absence of proof of payment. Many of these are not even payable. So it's not an amnesty, it's a data cleanup. And the benefit of this data cleanup for small demands is that you won't have to go through this process of having to prove, give me a copy of the challan, send it to that office, then they'll compare this and see, is this challan genuine? Because they don't have a copy. I mean, they don't have records to prove that the challan is genuine. They're relying on you to say, I actually paid it into State Bank of India on this date and here's the rubber stamp. So it's basically a cleanup of small demands, most of which are probably not even payable.
On the question of growth is looking good, everything is good. Is there an increased focus and let's try and find areas to grow which will also have employment potential?
Definitely.
Like tourism, for example.
Definitely. The government is very focused on areas that would create. Textiles is one, tourism another. Tourism has a lot of potential for us in India because India is actually a land with tremendous tourist potential, both domestic and international. I mean, it's a destination that a lot of people would like to come to from abroad. And for domestic tourists, there's so much to do in this vast country. I mean, for a person from Chennai, where I'm from, I mean, Banaras is completely different. It's not the same as Chennai. It's not like the difference between, say, Manchester and Birmingham is not comparable at all. I mean, so the potential is tremendous. What we lack is providing the tourist with a nice experience that would make the tourist go on a domestic tour rather than go abroad. If we can create the infrastructure, if we can create that quality of experience, then the sky is the limit in terms of what we can do. And that is why in the budget we have this proposal where the Government of India will provide state governments with an interest-free 50-year loan to choose one iconic destination in each state and truly bring it up to world-class levels of, accommodation, facilities, the amenities that are available, the attractions that you can go to, not just one main, I mean, you might have one main iconic attraction that people come to, but when they come there, you want them to stay for 3 or 4 days doing other things so that you actually keep them there for some time. So all of these things are planned in these iconic tourist centers, and that's one of the announcements in the budget.
Right. Well, I know it was that the finance minister said that in July we're going to get a full roadmap for the next 5-6 years. I'm not going to ask you to tell us the entire roadmap, but just offhand, any of the areas which you think should be priorities in the years going ahead?
I think one of the priorities will be, there is a lot of technological change going on. New technologies, green technologies, more efficient technologies, not just, but a lot of it in energy, but not just in energy. Typically what's happening is we tend to import most of these technologies. Yet India has a lot of capacity in human resources, in technical fields, in IITs, in engineering colleges, in NITs and so on, and in our private sector. We have excellent engineering companies, people who manufacture capital goods, people in the defense sector. We have a very capable private sector, and of course our capabilities in software are, absolutely need no repetition. So can we, using this, become a producer of world-class cutting-edge technologies in sunrise sectors where the sun hasn't risen yet? So you're not competing with an established global player. You are actually at approximately the same basement as everyone else. If you can establish yourself in these technologies, then we don't have to be a perpetual importer of technology. It is for that reason that we have this announcement of a 1 lakh crore corpus. This is a corpus that will actually provide funding to the private sector on for-profit ventures. It's not a research fund. It's a fund for-profit projects that are based on new and advanced innovative technology. But such technology typically is not yet quote unquote proven, in the sense that you may not have a bank willing to lend against it because you don't know whether the technology will succeed or not. And therefore, you need a form of financing which will enable the private sector to run with these risky technologies, prove them, take the time needed to move it from a prototype to an actual commercially saleable version. During that period, you need patient capital, and the government's initiative is to create a corpus. The corpus will be given to an institution, a financial institution owned by the government presumably, which would receive this money interest free for 50 years, which would then provide money to the private sector for long tenors at concessional rates of interest. It may not be 50 years, it may not be interest free. That is a margin which is given to the institution. The institution will operate this commercially and provide money to the private sector.
But it would be
low
cost finance.
Oh, absolutely.
Borrowing at 10,
low cost
12%.
and long duration. So it wouldn't be that you pay the loan in 5 years or start paying it in 2 years. It might be a long moratorium where you don't have to pay anything until it becomes profitable. But it doesn't necessarily have to be 50 years or interest free. That's all I'm trying to say.
All right. So that basically encourages companies to do a lot more.
And
take
this will
risks
be
in
where
innovation.
India can really, see a major spurt in growth and in employment if we get this right.
All right, sir. Any other things on the agenda for what you think we should be doing, focusing on to keep the growth going?
I think an important part of keeping the growth growing is the hygiene factor of macroeconomic stability. A lot of countries which have launched growth spurts have had to stop them because they've had either runs on the currency or run out of fiscal space. So I think we have a lot of excellent ideas, a lot of initiatives that the government can take, but going hand in hand with that is the fiscal policy that the government has over the last few years very consistently followed, of making sure that our macroeconomic conditions are very stable. We have adequate foreign exchange reserves, our debt is within manageable limits, our deficits are declining. These are not exciting things, and if anything are at the margin unpopular, but this is like hygiene. If you're running this 2047 marathon to become a developed country by 2047, you need to be, as I've been saying, fiscally fit in order to run this long race. To do that, you have to do these hygiene things and keep them in good shape. Otherwise, you won't be able to run the marathon. They may not be exciting, but they are necessary for you to do the exciting things.
All right, Swaminathan, thank you so much for talking to us. We look forward to getting more details on how that marathon is going to be run in July when the full budget comes. But It was a pleasure talking to you.
Pleasure talking to you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
That was the Finance Secretary, Mr. Swaminathan, talking to us, and you've been watching Sansad TV.